Thinking like a polymath isn't about simply knowing lots of facts from lots of different fields. Instead, it's about learning to ask the right questions about ideas in those fields that reveal new perspectives and new forms of truth. In this video, I'm going to draw upon my years of experience as an academically published value theorist to reveal how some of the top polymaths in history have educated themselves and how you can use 4 key categories of questions daily to become a truly diverse and well-rounded thinker. Starting with the first category, meta-scientific questioning. Now, in order to understand not only this category, but all of the 4 categories I'll share here, we have to understand a central concept in the philosophy of Edmund Husserl and how it relates to self-education. And that concept is transcendence. In his 1913 work, Ideas Pertaining to a Pure Phenomenology and to a Phenomenological Philosophy, yeah, I know that's a mouthful, Husserl uses the seemingly mundane example of a chair to demonstrate something profound about knowledge and perception, something that is in fact also studied in the cognitive sciences today. Imagine you walk into a room and see a chair. Think for a moment about what you experience in seeing or otherwise perceiving that chair. Do you actually perceive the chair in full? In other words, do you really perceive the chair itself? Well, Husserl's answer is complicated, but let's simplify it a bit. Imagine you now walk to a different side of the room, and now you see the chair from a different angle. Imagine you now look directly over the chair. You see it yet again from a completely different vantage point. Okay, Captain Obvious, so what's the point here? The point is that we never truly experience an object as it is, in full. We only ever experience different perspectives of that object at any given time. And our mind simply patches together all of these data points in our experiences to make it feel to us as though we're perceiving the object as a unified whole. However, in some sense, you could say that it's an illusion. And this is partially due to what neuroscientists call predictive processing, in which we predict what an object should be like based on previous sensory experience. But then, what does this all have to do with thinking like and becoming a polymath? Well, it's because this same pattern of perception spills over into our thinking in general. To put it simply, whenever we think about, study, or learn anything, we are always ever doing so from a particular perspective, through a particular lens, and from a particular vantage point, just as we do with respect to the chair. And just as we can only perceive the chair as a whole by perceiving it from multiple vantage points, so too will we now learn how to perceive the truth about anything we're learning from multiple vantage points. And we can only achieve this by mastering the 4 categories of questions we'll discuss. We can visualize these categories as legs of our chair. The first of which I've stated before is meta-scientific questioning. To really understand what this is, let's consider the famous polymath Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. Yeah, it's also a mouthful. When most people think of science, they think of formulas, measurements, and lab coats, but Goethe looked at science differently. For him, studying something like color wasn't just about light wavelengths. It was about how color feels to us, how it moves the human spirit. He asked questions like, why do certain colors feel warm or cold? How does perception itself shape our experience of reality? Goethe's science wasn't confined to microscopes. It was infused with art and philosophy, and that's what makes his work polymathic. He showed that even hard science can ask deeply aesthetic and human questions. And so let's break down what meta-scientific questioning looks like and how you can use it in your everyday learning. So let's say you're someone who's highly scientific or logical and you love analyzing science from its own perspective. That is, in the language and conceptual framework of data, models, prediction, hypothesis testing, and so on. Well, challenge yourself to periodically shift that language and that conceptual framework. About any scientific phenomenon, ask artistic and aesthetic questions such as, is there any beauty in this phenomenon? What feeling do I get from it? And how do others perceive this phenomenon? These artistic and aesthetic questions are yet one more leg on our chair, and it opens up another layer of truth, equally as true and meaningful as the purely scientific perspective. Yet, with respect to the same phenomenon, we can also ask philosophical questions, such as, is the model of this phenomenon equivalent to the phenomenon itself? And can I truly know the cause of this phenomenon, or can I simply know the predictive power of the model? Are they the same thing? And is it just a matter of semantics? By asking these questions, we move to yet another leg of the chair. We reveal yet further layers of truth and meaning. Once again, equally valid in their truth and meaning. But how about the fourth leg? Well, again, about the same phenomenon, we can ask social and psychological questions, such as what assumptions of social or psychological value underlie this line of inquiry? How are the phenomena named? And do they have any social meanings that this scientific knowledge could clash with? What exactly are the social goals of this line of inquiry? But now, as you might be beginning to see, when we examine one leg of the chair, we simultaneously view the other three, just from a different perspective. And so what this means is that we can always ask similar questions about each leg in relation to each other, which leads us to the next category of questioning, and therefore a revisitation of one of the previous legs of our chair, namely meta-aesthetic questioning. Leonardo da Vinci was one of the greatest polymaths in recorded history. He began with painting, with the challenge of making art look alive. But to do that, he asked scientific questions. How do muscles pull on bones? How does light bend through the eye? How does water swirl in motion? From there, he asked philosophical questions. What is beauty? What truth about nature are we capturing when we paint? And he even thought socially and psychologically. How do images affect emotion, persuasion, and collective imagination? For Da Vinci, art was never just art. It was the key to unlocking science, philosophy, and psychology all at once. And so whenever we encounter a beautiful sunset, a painting, some beautiful music, and so on, we should ask scientific questions such as, is there a mathematical function or pattern that models this? Or what happens in the brain when we perceive this experience? When we engage in these experiences, we can also ask philosophical questions such as, what is beauty? Is there any meaning in this experience? And if so, how would I discover it? And likewise, we can also ask social and psychological questions such as, what is the social meaning of this experience? And culturally, how do different people interpret it? And what effect does this or could this have on an individual's psychological state? It reminds me of when I first saw the geysers at Yellowstone Park. They're not only really beautiful along with their surroundings, but I quickly found out that they erupt at various intervals. Some of those intervals are fairly predictable, and some seem fairly erratic. And so the first thing that popped into my mind was, how can we possibly model the erratic ones? Is there some model or combination of models that could predict these eruptions? And if I think about it, it's partially my love of statistics, my love of philosophy, and my love of nature all together that even led me to ask these questions. And that kind of love is what thinking like a polymath is really about. But there are still two legs of our chair to discover here, ones without which our search for knowledge will be incomplete. And so that next leg of our chair is meta-philosophical questioning. Now, philosophy itself is already meta, and so what would meta-philosophical questioning even look like? Well, the philosopher Bertrand Russell is a great example. He began as a philosopher trying to untangle logic and the foundations of mathematics, but he didn't stop at pure theory. He asked scientific questions about philosophy, such as, what do the structures of logic tell us about the nature of reality itself? He asked aesthetic questions too. How can proofs be beautiful? How can writing be clear, elegant, and almost artistic in the way it communicates truth? And he asked social and psychological questions. How should philosophy shape our politics, our morality, and even our daily lives? Russell's polymathy came from refusing to keep philosophy locked away in an ivory tower. He connected it to science, art, and society. And so, how can you do the same thing in your quest for knowledge? Well, with respect to philosophical questions, you might ask yourself, is this truly a question for philosophy, or is it something more appropriate for the scientific method? What exactly is the philosophical basis of the scientific method that makes it valid in the first place? With respect to philosophy, we can also ask aesthetic questions, such as, how does this painting, this music, or this poem contribute to my understanding of some philosophical question? And can any philosophical truth be found in aesthetic experiences such as art or even nature? And we can even ask social and psychological questions about about philosophy, such as what assumptions from my culture or what psychological biases am I introducing into my thought process with respect to this philosophical question? And what implications does this philosophical idea have for society? At the end of the day, though, we all live in a society. Nearly every action we take affects someone else and affects some change within our community. In fact, we can even be said to be in large part a product of our community and society. And so it's especially important for the holistic attainment of knowledge to explore our fourth category, our fourth leg of the chair, which is meta-social questioning. The philosopher William James was a major contributor to the modern field of psychology, but he wasn't content just to catalog human behavior. He wanted to know how the mind really works. He asked scientific questions about consciousness, decision-making, and habit formation, but he didn't stop there. James turned those same questions philosophical. What does free will even mean if most of our lives are run by habit? And beyond that, he saw the artistic side of psychology, how religious and mystical experiences shape art, literature, and even meaning itself. James crossed psychology, philosophy, and aesthetics because he knew that human experience can't be captured through just one lens. And so how can you reproduce this same approach to knowledge? Well, when it comes to any social or psychological phenomenon you're investigating, ask scientific questions, such as, is there a model of this phenomenon that is predictive? And what are the assumptions of the model? Ask aesthetic questions, such as, what are people truly experiencing as participants in this phenomenon aside from the predictive model? And ask philosophical questions, such as, are there specific norms driving this behavior? And if so, are those norms justified or should they be changed? You see, the polymath, in short, utilizes critical thinking. Not in a one-track way, but instead in a holistic way. It's through critical thinking, what we might call the attitude of critical thinking, that we come to piece together that chair in our minds, see the entire truth for what it is all at once, and what can we say other than that this is a beautiful thing? If you want to keep leveling up your critical thinking to make a massive impact, not only on your own life, but also on the lives of countless others, then be sure to watch this next video.